Hi, I'm Delilah. My sister Rosalind called me worthless scum in front of a packed courtroom, demanding I be thrown out for impersonating someone important. She had no idea the judge she was begging to remove me was about to say, "Good morning, Your Honor," to me. The look on her face when she realized who I really was. Priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pause for effect. You know, they say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes blood can be poisonous. Growing up in Millbrook Heights, Rosalind was always the golden child, the one with the perfect grades, the scholarship to Whitmore University, the family favorite who could do no wrong. I was just there. The younger sister who barely scraped by, who worked 3 jobs to pay for community college, who everyone assumed would never amount to anything, and for the longest time, I believed them. See, our family had this tradition of looking down on people they considered beneath them. Mom was a real estate mogul. Dad ran the biggest law firm in 3 counties, Thornfield, Berkshire and Associate. They lived in this world where your worth was measured by your bank account and your last name. Rosalind fit right in. She married Trevor Ashworth, heir to the Ashworth manufacturing fortune, bought a mansion in Golden Crest Estates, and never let anyone forget how successful she was. I was the family disappointment, the one who wasted her potential, the one they barely invited to holiday dinners. But here's what they didn't know. What nobody knew. While they were counting their money and attending charity galas, I was quietly building something they never saw coming. Every night shift I worked at the diner. Every weekend I spent studying in the local library instead of partying. Every penny I saved instead of buying designer clothes. It was all leading somewhere. I had a plan. A secret that I kept locked away for 15 years. You see, when I was 18, I didn't just enroll in Riverside Community College, like everyone thought. I used that as a stepping stone. I transferred to Crestview University on a merit scholarship they never knew I earned. I graduated summa cum laude, with a degree in political science, while working nights to support myself. Then I went to Hillstone Law School, again on scholarship, again working multiple jobs, again keeping it all secret from my family who had already written me off. Why the secrecy? Because I learned early that when your family expects you to fail, sometimes the only way to succeed is in silence. Every time I tried to share good news, making Dean's List, getting accepted to law school, landing my first job at the prosecutor's office, they found ways to diminish. Community college doesn't count, they'd say. Or public service. How quaint. So I stopped sharing. I let them believe I was still working at Ruby's Diner in downtown Millbrook, still living in my tiny studio apartment on Elm Street, still the family failure who would never be anything more than a waitress. What they didn't know was that for the past 8 years, I'd been climbing the ranks in the judicial system, assistant prosecutor, to senior prosecutor, to district judge. I'd been appointed to the Circuit Court of Millbrook County by Governor Harrison himself. Achievement that would have made headlines if anyone in my family had bothered to pay attention to local news. But they did. They lived in their bubble of country clubs and business deals, completely oblivious to the fact that their worthless daughter had become one of the most respected judges in the county. And then came the call that changed everything. My secretary, Janet, buzzed in on a Tuesday morning. "Judge Thorne, I have an interesting case assignment for you. A state dispute. Ashworth versus Ashworth. Looks like a messy family inheritance battle. Ashworth." My heart stopped for a moment. Trevor's family, which meant I pulled up the case file and there it was. Rosalind Ashworth, plaintiff, challenging the will of her late father-in-law, Edmund Ashworth. She was fighting her own sister-in-law, claiming she deserved the entire Ashworth fortune because she was the only one capable of handling such responsibility. The irony was delicious. My sister, who had spent decades calling me worthless, was about to appear before me in court, begging for money she felt entitled to, completely unaware that the judge deciding her fate was the same sister she'd dismissed and discarded. As I read through her filing, her words cut just as deep as they had growing up. Plaintiff has demonstrated superior judgment and capability throughout her marriage, unlike certain family members who lack the intelligence and character necessary for financial responsibility. superior judgment. Unlike certain family members, she was still doing it, still putting others down to lift herself up, still believing that worth was something you inherited rather than earned. I leaned back in my leather chair, the same chair she'd never thought I'd be smart enough to deserve, and for once the universe was about to serve up some poetic justice. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, which meant in exactly 9 days, Rosalind would walk into courtroom 3B, probably wearing her designer suit and her entitled attitude, ready to argue why she deserved millions of dollars, based on her supposed superiority. And I would be sitting at the bench, wearing my judicial robes, holding her fate in my hands. The same hands she'd always said would never accomplish anything worthwhile. But here's the thing about underestimating people, especially family. Sometimes the person you've spent years looking down on has been looking up the whole time, up towards a goal you never thought they could reach, up towards a position of power you never imagined they'd attain. And sometimes, just sometimes, they reach it. I buzzed Janet back. "Accept the case," I said, unable to keep the anticipation out of my voice. "And Janet, make sure courtroom 3B is completely full for this hearing. I have a feeling it's going to be memorable." 9. That's all I had to wait to see the look on Rosalind's face, when she realized that the worthless sister she'd spent decades dismissing was about to decide whether she got a single penny of the Ashworth fortune. 9 days until the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire life. 9 days until justice, both legal and poetic, would finally be served. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my relationship with Rosalind is crucial to appreciating just how sweet this moment was about to become. We grew up in the sprawling Thornfield Manor, a Victorian estate that had been in our family for 3 generations. Our father, Harrison Thornfield, was the founding partner of Thornfield, Berkshire and Associates, the most prestigious law firm between here and the state capital. Our mother, Victoria, came from old money and never let anyone forget. She ran the Millbrook Heights Historical Society and chaired every charity gala worth attending. From the moment Rosalind could walk, she was everything they wanted in a daughter: beautiful, charming, academically gifted, and most importantly, she understood the family business of being important. She knew how to work a room, how to make the right connections, how to marry well and maintain the family's social standing. I was different. While Rosalind was winning debate tournaments and homecoming crowns, I was reading law books in our father's library and asking too many questions about justice and fairness, concepts that didn't always align with family business. When she was networking at cotillion balls, I was volunteering at the legal aid clinic downtown, helping people who couldn't afford lawyers like my father. The difference in how we were treated was stark and painful. Rosalind got the corner bedroom with the bay windows, overlooking the garden. I got the small room next to the staff quarters. Her achievements were celebrated with parties and newspaper announcements. Mine were met with polite smiles and quick subject changes. I'll never forget my high school graduation. I had earned the highest GPA in my class and was giving the valedictorian speech. As I stood at that podium, looking out at the crowd, I spotted my family in the 3rd row. Rosalind was checking her phone. Mother was whispering to the woman next to her about Rosalind's upcoming engagement. Father was reading legal briefs. None of them were listening to a word I said. That night at dinner, the conversation centered entirely around Rosalind's wedding plans to Trevor Ashworth, a match that had been years in the making. Trevor's father, Edmund Ashworth, owned Ashworth Manufacturing, the largest employer in 3 counties. It was, as Mother put it, a perfect alliance between 2 of the region's most prominent families. When I tried to mention my acceptance to Crestview University, Father barely looked up from his steak. "Crestview's a fine school, dear. Very practical." Practical. That was their code word for not prestigious enough to matter. Rosalind, however, was attending Whitmore University, the Ivy League school where Father had gone, where his father had gone, where all the right people sent their children. Her education was an investment in the family legacy. Mine was just an expense. The pattern continued through college. Every semester I'd come home with perfect grades, Dean's List honors, academic achievements that should have made any parent proud. But Rosalind's engagement party planning, her sorority presidency, her internship at a prestigious New York firm, secured through family connections, naturally, these were the accomplishments that got attention at family dinner. I started to understand that in the Thornfield family hierarchy, effort meant nothing if it didn't lead to the right kind of success. And the right kind of success was defined very narrowly: marry well, maintain social status, and never, ever associate with people who might diminish the family reputation. The real breaking point came during my junior year at Crest. I had been accepted to an incredible summer internship with the district attorney's office, a competitive position that hundreds of students had applied for. I was thrilled, finally, something that might impress them. I called home to share the news, practically vibrating with excitement. The DA's office, Mother's voice was ice cold. "Delilah, dear, we've discussed this. Public service is, well, it's admirable in its own way, but hardly appropriate for someone with your background. But Mother, this could lead to, what it could lead to," Father interrupted, "is embarrassment. The Thornfield name is associated with success, with prominence, not with prosecuting criminals and dealing with the unseemly side of society." "But you're a lawyer," I protest. "Your firm deals with criminals all the time. We defend them." "Darling," Mother said with a patronizing laugh, "there's a significant difference between defending prominent citizens who've made mistakes and hunting them down like some sort of vigilante." That conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes before they had to go. Rosalind was calling from Whitmore with urgent news about her engagement ring selection. I took the internship anyway, and I kept it secret. That was the moment I realized that if I wanted to build something meaningful with my life, I'd have to do it in the shadows. They'd made it clear that my dreams didn't fit their vision of who I should be, so I stopped trying to fit. I created a separate world for myself. At family events, I played the role they expected: the quiet younger daughter who worked at Ruby's Diner and lived in a tiny apartment downtown. But in reality, I was building something they never bothered to look closely enough to see. Law school applications, submitted in secret. Scholarship interviews, scheduled around my diner shifts. LSAT prep, disguised as just reading for fun. Every achievement earned in silence. Every milestone celebrated alone. The hardest part wasn't the secrecy. It was watching Rosalind receive endless praise for accomplishments that paled in comparison to what I was doing. Her law degree from Whitmore, where she graduated middle of her class, was celebrated with a graduation party. For my law degree from Hillstone, where I graduated first in my class, was something I celebrated alone with takeout Chinese food in my studio apartment. But you know what? Those solitary celebrations taught me something valuable. They taught me that real satisfaction comes from knowing your own worth, not from having others recognize it. They taught me that the most powerful position you can be in is the one where people underestimate you, because when people don't see you coming, you can build something incredible right under their noses. And that's exactly what I did. For 8 years, while Rosalind was playing Lady of the Manor and attending charity lunches, I was earning a reputation as one of the most fair and intelligent judges in the state. Legal precedents I'd set were being studied in law school. Attorneys sought assignment to my courtroom because they knew they'd get a thorough, impartial hearing. I had power, real power, the kind that comes from competence and respect rather than inheritance and connection. And in 9 days, Rosalind was going to find out exactly what kind of power her worthless little sister had been quietly accumulating all these years. The irony was perfect. She was coming to court to argue that she deserved the Ashworth fortune because she was superior, more capable, more worthy than everyone else. She was about to make that argument to the one person in the world who knew better than anyone else just how wrong she was. The call that would set everything in motion came on a rainy Wednesday morning in October. I was reviewing case files in my chambers when my personal phone buzzed, a number I hadn't seen in almost 2 years. "Trevor Ashworth." "Delilah?" His voice was strained, exhausted. "I need to talk to someone. Is there any chance we could meet? Trevor had always been different from the rest of his family, and different from Rosalind. While she'd married him for his money and status, he'd genuinely loved her, or at least the version of her she presented during their courtship. Over the years, the few times we'd crossed paths at family gatherings, he'd been kind to me, not condescending like the others, just. We met that evening at Mulligan's pub, on the outskirts of Riverside, far enough from Millbrook Heights that we wouldn't run into anyone from either of our families. Trevor looked like he'd aged a decade since I'd last seen him. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "My father died last month," he said without preamble, gripping his beer like a lifeline. "Heart attack. Sudden." I offered my condolences, but he waved them off. "That's not why I called you. It's about the will." He pulled out a thick envelope, his hands shaking slightly. "Delilah, I need someone I can trust, and you're the only person in either of our families who's ever been real with me." The will was a masterpiece of legal precision, and a complete Edmund Ashworth, the patriarch who'd built a manufacturing empire from nothing, had left very specific instructions about his fortune. The bulk of his estate, worth approximately $47 million, was to be placed in a trust. Trevor would receive a comfortable annual income, but the trust itself would be managed by the family member who has demonstrated the greatest commitment to justice, integrity, and service to others. That family member was identified as Trevor's sister, Lydia Ashworth Chen, a public defender who worked with underprivileged children in the inner city. Rosalind wasn't mentioned by name in the primary will. She was, however, referenced in a codicil that Edmund had added just 3 months before his death. Should my daughter-in-law Rosalind Ashworth contest this will on the grounds that she is more deserving than Lydia, she must prove her worthiness before an impartial court of law. If she fails to do so, she forfeits any claim to inheritance, and will receive exactly $1, as is my final wish. He knew, Trevor said quietly. He knew she'd fight it. Dad was a lot smarter than people gave him credit for. He saw through her act years ago. I read the document twice, my heart racing. Edmund Ashworth had essentially set a trap. If Rosalind accepted Lydia's inheritance, she'd continue to receive her current lifestyle through Trevor's annual income. But if she challenged it, which her pride and greed would almost certainly compel her to do, she'd risk losing everything. "She's going to contest it, isn't she?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Trevor nodded miserably. "She's been screaming about it for weeks. Says Lydia is a bleeding heart do-gooder who doesn't understand money. Says the fortune should go to someone who knows how to maintain the family's position in society. She's already hired Blackstone and Associates to file the challenge." Blackstone and Associates, the most expensive law firm in the state, and my father's biggest competitor. They specialized in helping rich people get richer, regardless of the ethics involved. "Trevor," I said carefully, "you know that challenging this will means going to court, right? A real courtroom, with a real judge, who'll examine the evidence, and make a decision based on law, not emotion." He looked at me with something that might have been hope. "You think she'll lose?" I thought about my sister, brilliant in her own way, but utterly convinced of her own superiority. She'd walk into that courtroom expecting to charm and manipulate her way to victory, the same way she'd done everything else in her life. She'd underestimate her opponents, overestimate her own case, and assume that wanting something badly enough was the same as deserving it. "I think," I said slowly, "that your father was a very wise man, and I think Rosalind is about to learn a lesson she should have learned a long time ago." Trevor's relief was palpable. "Will you be there, at the hearing?" I know it's a lot to ask, but I could use someone in my corner who is invested in the money. I almost laughed. If only he knew just how invested I was about to become, not in the money, but in the justice of it all. "I'll be there," I promised. "You can count on it." The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in a favor from Judge Patricia Wellmont, the chief administrative judge who handled case assignments for our district. Patricia and I had worked together for years. She was one of the few people who knew my full story, and had always respected my commitment to fairness. "Patricia, I need to ask you something unusual," I said. "The Ashworth estate case that's coming up, is there any chance it could be assigned to my docket? There was a pause. Delilah, that's a high-profile case, a lot of money involved. Are you sure you want that kind of attention? I'm sure. And Patricia, I need you to trust me when I say that I'm probably the only judge in this district who can guarantee true impartiality in this case. She didn't ask for details, but she didn't need to. Patricia understood that sometimes the universe presents opportunities for perfect justice, and when those opportunities arise, you don't question them. Consider it done, she said. The case is yours. That afternoon, I received the official assignment, Ashworth Estate Dispute, assigned to the Honorable Judge Delilah Thorne, courtroom. I sat in my chambers that evening, holding the assignment paper, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of anticipation mixed with the satisfaction of destiny finally aligning. For decades I'd watched Rosalind coast through life on unearned privilege, stepping on others to maintain her position, convinced that the world owed her everything she wanted simply because she existed. Now she was about to walk into my courtroom, my domain, and argue that she deserved $47 million, because she was superior to a woman who dedicated her life to helping children who couldn't help themselves. She was going to make that argument to me, the sister she'd dismissed as worthless, the sister whose achievements she'd never bothered to acknowledge, the sister who now held the power to grant or deny her deepest desire. But here's what made it even more perfect. She still had no idea who I was. To her, Judge Delilah Thorne was just a name on a court document. She'd never connected that name to her estranged sister who worked at a diner and lived in a studio apartment. Why would she? In her mind, I was incapable of achieving anything significant. I picked up my phone and called Janet, my court secretary. Janet, the Ashworth hearing on November 15th. I want full media coverage allowed. Contact the local newspapers, the legal journals, anyone who might be interested in covering a major estate dispute. And make sure we have extra seating available. I have a feeling this is going to draw quite a crowd. Of course, Your Honor. Anything special I should know about this case? I smiled, looking out my office window at the Millbrook Heights skyline, where somewhere in those expensive hills, my sister was probably planning her courtroom strategy, completely confident in her inevitable victory. Just make sure the nameplate on my bench is polished and clearly visible, I said. I want everyone in that courtroom to know exactly who's making the decisions. November 15th was still 2 weeks away, 2 weeks for Rosalind to prepare her case, to convince herself that she deserved Edmund Ashworth's fortune, to build up her expectations of easy victory. 2 weeks for me to prepare for the most satisfying moment of my entire career. 2 weeks until my sister learned that sometimes, the people you dismiss as worthless are the ones with the power to change your life forever. The formal court documents arrived at my apartment 3 days later, and reading them felt like being punched in the stomach by someone wearing brass knuckles made of pure malice. Rosalind hadn't just filed a challenge to Edmund Ashworth's will, she'd submitted a character assassination disguised as legal documentation. Page after page of carefully worded attacks, not just on Lydia Ashworth Shane's qualifications, but on anyone who might dare suggest that wealth should be earned rather than inherited. I sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I'd studied for the bar exam years ago, and read every word of her filing. My hands trembled with a mixture of rage and disbelief as her true nature revealed itself in black and white legal prose. The deceased's decision to leave his substantial estate to Lydia Ashworth Shane represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes worthiness in managing significant family assets. The document read, Ashworth Shane's choice to pursue public service, while admirable in a superficial sense, demonstrates a lack of practical judgment and business acumen necessary for preserving generational wealth. But that was just the warm-up. The real gut punch came in Section 4, where Rosalind's attorney had included a detailed argument about why she, specifically, deserved the inheritance. Mrs. Rosalind Ashworth has demonstrated throughout her marriage exceptional judgment in social, financial, and familial matters. Unlike certain family members who have consistently made poor life choices and associated with individuals beneath their station, Mrs. Ashworth has maintained the dignity and respectability that the Ashworth name requires. Certain family members, She didn't name me directly, but she didn't need to. I was the only family member who could be described that way, the one who'd supposedly made poor life choices by working service jobs and living modestly. The filing continued. Miss Ashworth's background reflects the values of hard work, education, and social responsibility that the deceased claimed to admire. She graduated with honors from Whitmore University, one of the nation's most prestigious institutions, and has dedicated herself to supporting charitable causes and maintaining the family's reputation in the community. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Graduated with honor. Rosalind had barely scraped by at Whitmore, and only because our father had made several generous donations to the university. Her idea of charitable causes consisted of attending gala dinners where she could network with other wealthy people while wearing expensive gowns. But the document wasn't finished destroying people yet. The next section took aim at Lydia directly. In contrast, Ashworth Chan has chosen a career path that, while perhaps emotionally satisfying to her personally, demonstrates a fundamental disconnect from the practical realities of wealth management. Her work with underprivileged populations suggests a worldview that prioritizes sentiment over sound financial principles. I had to read that sentence 3 times before I could believe someone had actually written it. Rosalind was arguing that helping underprivileged children was evidence of poor judgment, that dedicating your life to justice was somehow disqualifying for managing money ethically. The final blow came in the closing argument. The petitioner submits that true worthiness lies not in misguided idealism, but in proven ability to maintain and elevate family status. Mrs. Ashworth represents the embodiment of the values that made the Ashworth fortune possible, while Ms. Ashworth Chan's choices reflect a rejection of those same values. I set the papers down and walked to my bathroom mirror. Looking at my reflection, I tried to reconcile the woman staring back at me, someone who'd earned respect through competence and integrity, with the implied portrait Rosalind had painted of our family's failure. In her mind, I was Exhibit A of what happened when people made poor life choices. The cautionary tale she could point to when explaining why people like Lydia shouldn't be trusted with serious responsibilities. My phone rang, interrupting my spiral of anger. It was Trevor again. "Delilah, have you seen the court filing?" His voice was hollow, defeated. "I just finished reading it. She's lost her mind, completely lost her mind. Do you know what she said to me last night? She said Lydia's work with kids was practically communist, and that my father must have been manipulated by bleeding heart propaganda when he wrote the will." I gripped the phone tighter. "What else did she say?" "She's convinced she's going to win easily. Says any reasonable judge will see that she's obviously more qualified than someone who wastes her education helping criminals and drug addicts." Her words, not mine. Criminals and drug addicts. Rosalind was describing children in the foster care system, kids who'd been abandoned, abused, or orphaned, as if they were somehow morally defective for needing help. "Trevor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, is this who she's always been? This cruel, or is the money bringing out something new?" There was a long pause. I think the money just gave her permission to say out loud what she's always thought. About people who aren't like us, I mean. People who don't have advantage. People like me. I thought. People like the version of me she thinks exists. "She's planning to testify personally," Trevor continued. "Her lawyer advised against it, but she insists. Says she wants to look the judge in the eye and explain why she deserves Dad's legacy." The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. Rosalind was going to stand in my courtroom and explain to my face why people like me, people who worked service jobs, people who lived modestly, people who chose service over status, were inherently inferior to people like her. After I hung up with Trevor, I did something I'd never done before as a judge. I called in sick for the rest of the week and drove to Riverside, to the small apartment I still officially maintained as my real address. I needed time to process what I'd learned, and I needed to see something that would remind me why this mattered. I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years, Letters and cards from people I'd helped during my time as a prosecutor and later as a judge. A grandmother thanking me for helping her get custody of her grandchildren after their mother's arrest. A teenage boy whose life I'd changed by offering community service instead of jail time for a first offense. A woman who'd written to say that my fair handling of her divorce case had allowed her to start over with dignity. These were the people Rosalind was dismissing as unworthy. These were the poor life choices she was talking about, choosing to help people who couldn't help themselves. I thought about Lydia Ashworth Chen, a woman I'd never met, but who'd devoted her career to representing children who had no one else. In Rosalind's worldview, Lydia's choice to use her law degree to help kids instead of making money was evidence of poor judgment. But in my worldview, in the worldview of someone who'd actually earned their position through merit rather than inheritance, Lydia represented everything Edmund Ashworth had been looking for, someone who understood that real worthiness comes from what you give, not what you take. I spent that week preparing for the hearing with an intensity I'd never brought to any case. I researched every precedent, every legal principle, every possible argument either side might make. Not because I intended to be anything other than completely impartial, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain that when I made my ruling, it would be unassailable. When someone has spent their entire life underestimating you, there's a particular satisfaction in being so thoroughly prepared that their arguments crumble on contact with reality. The weekend before the hearing, I received one final call from Trevor. "She's bringing Mom and Dad," he said. "Your parents. She wants them there to support her testimony about family values and worthiness." My blood ran cold. Mother and father would be in the courtroom. They'd see me on the bench. Finally, after all these years of dismissing my achievement, they'd realize that while they were celebrating Rosalind's superficial successes, their other daughter had been quietly building something that actually mattered. "Trevor," I said carefully, "did you mention to anyone that we've been talking? God, Rosalind would kill me if she knew I was in contact with your family. She barely tolerates the fact that I used to be friendly with you at family gatherings." Perfect. The surprise would be complete. Tuesday morning, November 15th, I put on my judicial robes and looked in the mirror one final time. In 3 hours, my sister would walk into my courtroom, expecting to convince some anonymous judge that she deserved $47 million because people like me were inherently inferior. Instead, she was about to learn that the person she'd spent her entire life underestimating was the one who would decide her fate. Justice, I thought, adjusting my collar, has the most beautiful sense of irony. The weekend before the hearing, I decided to do something that went against every professional instinct I'd developed over my judicial career. I was going to investigate my own sister. Not for the case, that would be completely unethical, but for my own peace of mind. I needed to understand exactly how deep Rosalind's deception and manipulation had gone over the years, because reading her court filing had opened a door to questions I'd never thought to ask. I started with something simple: her college transcript. As a sitting judge, I had access to certain verification systems that most people don't. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Rosalind hadn't just barely graduated from Whitmore University. She'd actually been placed on academic probation twice and had failed 3 core courses in her junior year. The only reason she'd graduated at all was because of a special academic review that coincidentally occurred right after our father had donated $250,000 to the university's new library wing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found when I dug deeper into those failed courses. One was constitutional law, another was ethics and legal practice. The third was social justice and public policy. She'd literally failed the classes that taught the basic principles of fairness and justice, then had those failures magically erased with family money. I thought about all those years she'd lorded her prestigious education over me, talking about how Whitmore had given her such a superior foundation in legal thinking. Meanwhile, I'd been earning straight A's at Crestview University, while working 30 hours a week to pay my own tuition. But the academic fraud was just the beginning. Next, I looked into her supposed charitable work, the foundation activities she'd listed in her court filing as evidence of her worthiness. The Millbrook Heights Children's Fund, which she claimed to have spearheaded, had indeed been founded in her name. But when I traced the financial records, I discovered that the fund had raised over $400,000 in donations over the past 5 years. Of that money, $80,000 had gone to administrative costs, meaning salaries for Rosalind and her friends who served on the board. Only $20,000 had actually reached children in need. $20,000 out of nearly $500,000. I sat in my apartment that Saturday night, surrounded by printouts and financial documents, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't just about inheritance money anymore. This was about a pattern of deception and manipulation that had been going on for years. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Judge Thorne, this is Lydia Ashworth Chen. Trevor gave me your contact information. I hope it's appropriate to reach out, but I wanted to thank you for taking this case. I know it's probably just another hearing for you, but it means everything to me and the kids I work with. I stared at that message for a long time. Lydia had no idea who I really was, but she was thanking me for the opportunity to defend her life's work. Meanwhile, my sister was preparing to argue that Lydia's dedication to helping children was evidence of poor judgment. I called Trevor. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Has Rosalind ever actually done any real charity work? Not galas, not fundraisers where she gets her picture in the society pages. Real work. There was a long pause. Define real work. Hands-on helping people, volunteering at shelters, tutoring kids, anything that involved actually spending time with people who needed help. Another pause. Longer this time. Delilah, I don't think Rosalind has ever voluntarily spent time with anyone who made less money than she does. When we got married, she made me fire our housekeeper because she said the woman was too familiar, which meant she smiled too much and asked how our day was. What about the children's fund? Trevor's laugh was bitter. You mean her shopping fund? She treats that foundation like her personal piggy bank. Last month she bought a $15,000 handbag and charged it to outreach expenses, because she wore it to a charity lunch. I felt that familiar rage building again, but this time it was mixed with something else, determination. This wasn't just about my personal relationship with Rosalind anymore. This was about protecting someone who genuinely deserved protection and exposing someone who'd been using charity as a personal ATM. Trevor, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me completely, even if it seems strange. Okay, I need you to get me copies of the Children's Fund financial records, bank statements, expense reports, everything you can access as her husband. Delilah, why would you just trust me? And Trevor, don't tell anyone we've had this conversation. Anyone. He agreed, though I could hear the confusion in his voice. 3 days later, a package arrived at my apartment containing everything I'd asked for, plus some things I hadn't expected. The financial records confirmed what I'd suspected: systematic embezzlement disguised as charitable expenses. But Trevor had included something else: emails between Rosalind and her lawyer, discussing strategy for the hearing. In one email, Rosalind had written, "Make sure you emphasize that public service work is essentially a hobby for rich kids who want to feel good about themselves. Lydia's just playing with poor children because she can afford to. Real adults understand that money requires serious management by serious people." Another email was even worse. "I've been thinking about what to say about my own qualifications. Should I mention how I've had to manage household staff and coordinate social events? That's essentially human resources and project management. Much more relevant than whatever finger painting therapy Lydia does with those kids." Finger painting therapy. She was describing legal advocacy for abused and neglected children as finger painting therapy. But the email that made my hands shake with rage was the last one in the pile. "The judge assigned to our case is some woman named Delilah Thorne. Never heard of her, which probably means she's a nobody who got appointed through political connections rather than merit. Should be easy to manage if we present the right image of authority and competence. A nobody, appointed through political connections rather than merit." I read that line 12 times before I could move past. My sister was planning to walk into my courtroom and manage me because she assumed I was incompetent. She was going to try to manipulate me the same way she'd manipulated everyone else in her life, through false charm and assumed superiority. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I researched myself. I looked up every case I'd decided, every legal precedent I'd set, every law review article that had mentioned my work. I wanted to see my own career through the eyes of someone who didn't know me personally. What I found was impressive, even by my own standards. In 8 years on the bench, I'd never had a ruling overturned on appeal. Legal scholars had praised my meticulous attention to detail and my unwavering commitment to justice over convenience. The State Bar Journal had featured me in an article about rising stars in the judiciary. I wasn't just competent, I was exceptional, and Rosalind thought she could manage me because she'd never bothered to learn who I really was. I spent the rest of that week preparing for the hearing with methodical precision. I reviewed every aspect of estate law that might apply to the case. I researched the legal precedents for determining worthiness in contested wills. I studied the financial documents Trevor had provided until I could recite them from memory. But most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for what was about to happen. Because in 48 hours my sister was going to stand in my courtroom and argue that she deserved $47 million because people like me, people who chose service over status, were inherently inferior. She was going to make that argument while looking directly at me, without realizing that I was living proof of everything she claimed to believe was impossible. Monday night, I laid out my judicial robes and polished my nameplate. Tomorrow, Rosalind would learn that the nobody judge she planned to manipulate was actually the sister she'd spent her entire life underestimating. And she was going to learn it in front of our parents, the media, and a courtroom full of witnesses who would watch her entire worldview crumble in real time. Justice wasn't just going to be served, it was going to be served with a side of perfect, poetic irony. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November drizzle that makes everything look washed out and dreary. I woke up at 5 a.m., 2 hours before my alarm, my stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread that I'd never experienced before any hearing. This wasn't just about the case anymore, this was about 28 years of being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated by my own family. This was about every achievement that had been ignored, every milestone that had been minimized, every time I'd been made to feel like I didn't matter. I arrived at the courthouse at 7:30 a.m., a full hour and a half before the hearing was scheduled to begin. The building was mostly empty, except for security guards and custodial staff. I needed this time alone to center myself, to make sure I could handle what was about to happen with the professional composure my position required. My chambers felt different that morning. The same leather chair, the same oak desk, the same diplomas and awards on the walls, but everything seemed charged with electricity, as if the room itself knew something momentous was about to occur. I reviewed my notes one final time, though I could have recited them in my sleep. I'd prepared for every possible legal argument, every precedent either side might cite, every procedural question that could arise. I was as ready as any judge had ever been for any case. What I wasn't prepared for was the phone call I received at 8:15 a.m. "Your Honor." Janet's voice was tight with stress. "I have Harrison Thornfield on the line. He says he's calling on behalf of his daughter, and needs to speak with you immediately about the Ashworth case." My father was calling me, though he had no idea he was calling. "Put him through," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Judge Thorne." His voice was exactly as I remembered, authoritative, commanding, used to getting what he wanted. "This is Harrison Thornfield of Thornfield, Berkshire and Associates. I represent my daughter Rosalind Ashworth in the matter being heard this morning." I almost laughed. He didn't represent her. Blackstone and Associates was handling the case, but apparently he couldn't resist inserting himself into what he saw as a guaranteed victory. "Miss Thornfield, I'm not sure what you're calling about, but any communication regarding this case should go through proper legal channels." Of course, I'm simply calling as a courtesy judge to judge, so to speak. "I wanted you to know that this case involves a very prominent family, and I'm confident that once you hear the evidence, you'll see that my daughter represents exactly the kind of person Edmund Ashworth intended to benefit." Judge to judge. He was pulling rank, assuming that his reputation in the legal community would influence my decision. "Mr. Thornfield, I can assure you that I will review all evidence impartially and make my decision based solely on the law and the facts presented. Naturally, I just wanted to mention that my daughter has impeccable credentials. Whitmore University. Extensive charitable work, a lifetime of responsible management of significant assets. In contrast, the other party, well, let's just say that working with underprivileged populations, while admirable, hardly qualifies someone to manage a $47 million estate. There it was. The same dismissive attitude toward public service, the same assumption that helping people in need was somehow evidence of poor judgment. He was giving me a preview of exactly what Rosalind would argue in court.
I see. And you feel qualified to make this assessment
Because I've spent my entire career distinguishing between people who have the judgment to handle serious responsibilities and people who don't. My younger daughter, for example, works in a diner and lives in some tiny apartment downtown. Sweet girl, but clearly lacks the practical intelligence necessary for important decisions. My older daughter, Rosalind, represents everything we should value in leadership. He was talking about me, explaining why I was too stupid for important responsibilities, while asking me to make the most important decision of Rosalind's life. Mr. Thornfield, I think we should end this conversation. I'll see you in court. Of course. I'm confident you'll make the right decision, Your Honor. After I hung up, I sat in my chair for 10 minutes, staring at the phone. My own father had just called me incompetent while asking me to rule in favor of his preferred daughter. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. At 8:45, Janet buzzed in again. Your Honor, there's quite a crowd gathering in the hallway. Mrs. Ashworth arrived with what appears to be an entourage. I looked through the one-way glass that allowed me to observe the corridor outside my courtroom. Rosalind was holding court in the hallway, literally. She was surrounded by my parents, Trevor, several people I didn't recognize who were probably character witnesses, and a small army of expensive-looking attorneys. She was wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, with jewelry that caught the fluorescent lights and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. Her hair was styled to perfection, her makeup flawless. She looked like she was attending a photo shoot rather than a legal proceeding. But it was her demeanor that struck me most. She was animated, confident, almost giddy with excitement. She kept gesturing toward the courtroom doors and laughing at something one of the attorneys was saying. This wasn't a woman nervous about a legal challenge. This was a woman who was absolutely certain of victory. My mother stood beside her, nodding approvingly at whatever Rosalind was saying. Father was checking his phone with the air of someone who had better things to do but was making time for this minor inconvenience. Neither of them looked like they had any doubt about the outcome. At 8:55, I saw Lydia Ashworth Chen arrive. The contrast was striking. Where Rosalind had an entourage, Lydia came alone except for one attorney. A young woman who looked like she might be a public defender. Where Rosalind's outfit screamed expensive taste, Lydia wore a simple black suit that was professional but clearly off the rack. Where Rosalind was holding court, Lydia quietly took a seat on a bench and reviewed her notes. But what struck me most about Lydia was her composure. She wasn't nervous or intimidated by Rosalind's show of force. She looked like someone who'd been fighting uphill battles her entire career and had learned not to be impressed by expensive suits and entitled attitudes. At exactly 9 a.m., I heard the bailiff call out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Delilah Thorne." This was it. In 30 seconds I would walk into that courtroom and take my place on the bench. Rosalind would see me for the first time in 2 years, but she wouldn't recognize me as anyone important. Just another judge, another obstacle to overcome on her way to $47 million. My parents would see me in judicial robes for the first time in their lives, but they wouldn't understand the significance. They'd never bothered to learn what I'd accomplished, so they wouldn't make the connection between Judge Delilah Thorne and their unsuccessful younger daughter. I straightened my robes, picked up my gavel and walked toward the door that connected my chambers to the courtroom. On the other side of that door, my entire family was waiting for me to make a decision that would change all of our lives forever. They just had no idea that I was the one making it. I paused for one moment, my hand on the door handle, and thought about that 18-year-old girl giving her valedictorian speech to a family that wasn't listening. About all the achievements that had been dismissed, all the accomplishments that had been minimized, all the times I'd been made to feel invisible. Today, I wouldn't be invisible anymore. Today, for the first time in my life, my family was going to see me exactly as I was, someone with real power, real authority, and real control over their future. I opened the door and stepped into my moment of truth. I stepped into the courtroom and immediately felt the shift in energy. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The rustle of papers ceased. Everyone rose as protocol demanded, but I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes studying me, trying to assess what kind of judge they were dealing with. From my elevated position on the bench, I had a perfect view of the entire courtroom. Rosalind sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 3 attorneys from Blackstone and Associates. She looked up at me with the practiced smile she'd perfected for meeting important people. Warm, but not too familiar, respectful, but confident. She had no idea she was looking at her sister. Behind her in the gallery, I spotted my parents immediately. Mother wore her favorite pearl necklace and the navy suit she reserved for important occasions. Father sat with the posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Both of them were studying me with the detached interest they might show a restaurant server. Someone whose competence mattered temporarily but who wasn't worth remembering afterward. On the defendant's side, Lydia Ashworth Chen sat with her single attorney, a woman who looked to be in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and an expression that suggested she'd fought plenty of David versus Goliath battles before. Trevor sat behind them, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Please be seated," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's excellent acoustics. "We are here today for the matter of Ashworth versus Ashworth, regarding the estate of Edmund Ashworth, deceased." I had just finished the opening procedural statements when something unexpected happened. A man in his 70s approached the bailiff and whispered something urgently. The bailiff walked over to my bench. "Your Honor, this gentleman says he has critical information regarding this case and needs to speak with the court immediately." I looked down at the man. He was well dressed but not ostentatiously so, with silver hair and the kind of lined face that suggested a lifetime of serious thinking. Something about him seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. "State your name and your connection to this case," I said. "William Chen, Your Honor. I'm a retired federal judge and Lydia Ashworth Chen's father." I apologize for the irregular timing, but I only learned about this hearing yesterday, and I have information that directly bears on the central question of worthiness being debated here today. Lydia's father. I glanced at her and saw she looked as surprised as everyone else. Clearly, his appearance was unexpected. Rosalind's lead attorney stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This individual wasn't on any witness list and has no standing in this matter." "Your Honor," Judge Chen continued before I could respond, "I have in my possession documents that Edmund Ashworth specifically asked me to safeguard, with instructions that they only be opened in the event that his will was contested. Ashworth and I served together on the State Judicial Ethics Committee for 15 years. He trusted me with information that he felt might be necessary to defend his final wishes." The courtroom fell silent. This was completely unexpected, and from the look on Rosalind's face, it was not welcome news. "Approach the bench," I instructed both legal teams. When all the attorneys had gathered, I spoke quietly. "Judge Chen, what exactly are you claiming to possess?" "Edmund Ashworth gave me a sealed envelope 3 months before his death. It contains what he described as insurance, documentation of his reasoning for the will's provisions, along with evidence he'd gathered about various family members' character and conduct. He was quite specific that it should only be opened if someone challenged Lydia's inheritance." Rosalind's attorney looked panicked. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We've had no opportunity to examine these alleged documents or verify their authenticity." "The envelope has never been opened," Judge Chen replied calmly. "Mr. Ashworth sealed it with wax and had me sign across the seal as a witness. It can be opened here in open court with all parties present to verify its contents together." I considered the situation carefully. This was unusual but not unprecedented. "I'll allow it, but with conditions. The envelope will be opened in my presence with all counsel observing. Any documents inside will be examined by both parties before being admitted as evidence." We returned to our positions, and Judge Chen approached the witness stand. The bailiff swore him in, and he produced a large manila envelope from his briefcase. Even from the bench, I could see the red wax seal and multiple signatures across. "Your Honor," Judge Chen said as he carefully broke the seal, Edmund Ashworth was a methodical man who believed in preparation. He told me he'd spent considerable time investigating the character of potential heirs, because he wanted to ensure his life's work would continue to benefit society rather than simply enrich individuals. He opened the envelope and removed a thick stack of documents. As he began to read through them, his eyebrows rose steadily higher. Mr. Ashworth appears to have conducted quite thorough background investigations, Judge Chen said, his voice carefully neutral. There are financial records, academic transcripts, correspondence, and what appears to be surveillance reports on multiple family members. Rosalind shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I could see sweat beginning to bead on her forehead despite the cool courtroom temperature. Judge Chen continued reading, occasionally glancing up with expressions that ranged from surprise to disgust. Finally, he looked directly at me. Your Honor, these documents paint a very clear picture of Mr. Ashworth's reason. He appears to have discovered significant evidence of financial impropriety, academic fraud, and charitable embezzlement relating to one of the potential heirs. He also included a detailed analysis of both Lydia's work and the work of other family members, with extensive documentation of their respective contributions to society. Objection. Rosalind's attorney stood so quickly he knocked over his water glass. This is prejudicial and inflammatory. These documents haven't been properly authenticated. Sustained in part, I ruled. Judge Chen, please limit your testimony to factual descriptions of the document's contents without editorial commentary, but the damage was already done. Everyone in the courtroom could see that Edmund Ashworth had been far more informed about his potential heirs than anyone had realized. The look of supreme confidence had completely disappeared from Rosalind's face, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. Judge Chen methodically went through the documents, describing financial records that showed systematic charity fraud, academic records that revealed purchased grades, and character assessments that were damning in their clinical precision. There's also a letter here addressed to whoever adjudicates this matter, Judge Chen said. Mr. Ashworth wrote, I have observed that true worthiness reveals itself not in grand gestures or social positioning, but in quiet, consistent service to others. Some people spend their lives taking credit for achievements they didn't earn, while others accomplish remarkable things without seeking recognition. I trust that any fair examination of the evidence will make clear which category each potential heir belongs to. As Judge Chen read those words, I felt something shift inside me. Edmund Ashworth had understood something that my own family never had, that real worth isn't about status or recognition, but about what you contribute when no one is watching. Your Honor, Judge Chen concluded. Mr. Ashworth included specific instructions that all of this information should be considered alongside any testimony given by the parties themselves. He believed that when people reveal their true character under oath, it becomes clear whether they deserve to inherit the fruit of a lifetime's honest work. I looked out at the courtroom. Rosalind appeared to be in shock, staring at the documents as if they were snakes that might bite her. My parents looked confused and slightly alarmed. Trevor looked relieved, as if a weight he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. But most importantly, Lydia looked calm and unafraid. She sat with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to hide, someone whose life's work could withstand any scrutiny. Thank you, Judge Chen, I said. These documents will be entered as evidence and reviewed by both parties. We'll take a 30-minute recess to allow counsel to examine them. As the courtroom began to empty for the break, I caught sight of Rosalind frantically whispering with her attorneys. I could only imagine what they were telling her, but from her increasingly pale complexion, I suspected the news wasn't good. Edmund Ashworth had reached out from beyond the grave to ensure that justice would be served. He'd given me everything I needed to make the right decision, not just legally but morally. Now I just had to wait for Rosalind to take the stand and reveal her true character to everyone present, just as he'd predicted she would. What I found was a masterclass in methodical investigation that would have impressed any prosecutor. Edmund Ashworth hadn't just been suspicious of Rosalind, he'd been downright forensic in his approach to understanding her character. The documents were organized into distinct sections, each more damning than the last. The first section contained financial records from the Millbrook Heights Children's Fund that went back 5 years. Edmund had somehow obtained copies of every bank statement, every expense report, and every donation record, He'd highlighted patterns of abuse in yellow marker, with handwritten notes in the margins that revealed a sharp analytical mind. June 2019, $15,000 raised at charity gala, $12,000 transferred to administrative consulting, paid to RTA Consulting, LLC. In the margin, Edmund had written, RTA Consulting registered to Rosalind T. Ashworth, no actual consulting services provided. September 2019, $8,000 raised for back-to-school supplies, $7,500 spent on educational materials from Premium Learning Solutions. His note: Premium Learning Solutions is a luxury tutoring service for wealthy children. No supplies ever reached underprivileged kids. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Money raised ostensibly for charity, then diverted to companies that either didn't exist or provided services exclusively for Rosalind and her social circle. The second section was even more devastating. Edmund had obtained Rosalind's complete academic records from Whitmore University, including internal administrative notes that should have been confidential. Student placed on academic probation September 2003 following failure of 3 core courses. One note: Father Harrison Thornfield contacted Dean Morrison regarding potential library donation. Students' grades amended following $250,000 contribution to library construction fund. Another note, dated 6 months later: student again failing constitutional law and ethics courses. Per conversation with Dean Morrison, grades will be adjusted to C+, following receipt of additional $100,000 donation for faculty research fund. Edmund had done the math. Over her 4 years at Whitmore, the Thornfield family had donated a total of $405,000 to various university programs. Each donation had been followed within weeks by improvements to Rosalind's transcript, but the third section was what made my hands tremble as I read it. Edmund had hired a private investigator to document Rosalind's daily activities over a 6-month period. The surveillance reports painted a picture of breathtaking callousness and entitlement. Subject observed at Millbrook Heights Children's Fund office, 10:30 a.m. Meeting lasted 15 minutes. Subject spent time selecting items from donated clothing intended for distribution to needy families. Took several designer items for personal use. Subject attended charity lunch at Golden Crest Country Club, ostensibly to plan winter coat drive for homeless shelter. Actual meeting consisted of planning holiday party for fund board members. No discussion of homeless shelter needs observed. Subject visited Riverside Food Bank for publicity photo session. Spent 20 minutes posing with food packages. Did not participate in actual food distribution. Left immediately after photos were taken, stating she needed to get cleaned up before dinner at parents' house. The most damning entry was dated just 3 months ago. Subject overheard on phone call with husband discussing stupid people who actually believe charity work matters. Quote, "It's all about the tax write-offs and the social connections. Trev, only idiots actually care about helping poor people. You help poor people by giving successful people more money to create opportunities." I sat back in my chair, feeling sick. This wasn't just financial fraud or academic dishonesty. This was sociopathy wrapped in designer clothing and passed off as charitable virtue. The final section contained Edmund's handwritten analysis of both Rosalind and Lydia, clearly written as he was making his decision about about Lydia. In 30 years of observing human behavior, I have rarely encountered someone whose private actions so completely align with their public principles. Investigation reveals that donates 40% of her salary to causes she supports, volunteers 20 hours per week beyond her paid work, and has personally mentored 47 at-risk youth over the past decade. She lives modestly, not from lack of ambition, but from genuine belief that excess wealth should be used to help others. This is exactly the kind of person who should steward family resources. About Rosalind, R represents everything I spent my life working against: the belief that wealth exists solely for personal gratification and social positioning. Her charitable work is performance art designed to maintain social status while avoiding actual contact with those in need. She views poverty as a character flaw and sees helping others as something that should benefit the helper more than the help. Giving her control of family resources, would be a betrayal of every value I tried to instill in my children. A knock on my chamber door interrupted my reading. Your Honor, Janet's voice was tense. I think you need to know what's happening in the hall. I opened the door to find Janet looking genuinely distressed. Mrs. Ashworth is having what appears to be a complete breakdown. She's screaming at her attorneys that they need to make this go away, and demanding to know why they didn't prepare her for. Her parents are trying to calm her down, but she's making quite a scene. I walked to my observation window and looked out at the hallway. Rosalind was indeed in the middle of what could only be described as a meltdown. Her perfect hair was disheveled from running her hands through it. Her expensive makeup was smeared from tears of rage. She was gesticulating wildly while her lawyers tried to speak to her in hushed tones. They can't use those documents. I could hear her voice clearly through the hallway's acoustics. That's invasion of privacy. That's entrapment. Make them go away. My father was attempting to restore order with the commanding presence that had served him well in courtrooms for decades. Rosalind, compose yourself. We'll challenge the admissibility of anything inappropriate. Daddy, you don't understand. Those documents, they make me look. She couldn't finish the sentence. They make you look like what? My mother's voice carried the sharp edge it had always had when she was losing patience. Like I'm not. Rosalind was crying now, ugly tears that ruined her careful presentation. Like I'm not good enough. Like I don't deserve this. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in her life, Rosalind had spoken a truth she'd never been willing to acknowledge. Deep down, she knew she didn't deserve the things she'd always felt entitled to. Trevor stood apart from the family drama, watching his wife's breakdown with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been sadness, or relief, or simply the exhaustion of someone who'd been propping up a lie for too long. Lydia and her attorney were also in the hallway, but they stood quietly near the courtroom doors, reviewing their notes, and speaking in low professional tone. The contrast was stark. On one side, chaos and entitlement colliding with reality. On the other, calm preparation and quiet dignity. I returned to my desk and picked up the final document in Edmund's package, a sealed letter addressed simply to the presiding judge. I opened it carefully and read Edmund's final words on the matter. To whoever reads this, I have spent considerable time and money investigating the character of my potential heirs because I believe that wealth carries responsibility. Money can amplify the best or worst aspects of human nature. Give it to someone with integrity, and it becomes a force for good. Give it to someone without moral foundation, and it becomes a weapon used against the vulnerable. The choice before you is not simply about legal technicalities or family relationships. It is about whether society's resources flow to those who will use them to build or to those who will use them to take. I trust that any fair examination of the evidence will make the correct choice obvious. I have structured this bequest to force the truth into the light. Those who deserve inheritance will welcome scrutiny. Those who do not will reveal themselves through their reaction to being examined. Watch carefully how each party responds. When their true character is exposed, that will tell you everything you need to know. I folded the letter and looked at the clock. The recess was almost over. In a few minutes I would call the court back to session, and Rosalind would have to take the stand to defend her claim to $47 million. She would have to do so while knowing that every lie she'd told, every fraud she'd committed, and every cruel judgment she'd made was now documented evidence in the hands of the court. Edmund Ashworth had given me more than just evidence. He'd given me a complete roadmap to justice, drawn by someone who understood that sometimes the truth needs help revealing itself. Now all I had to do was let Rosalind finish the job of destroying herself. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Rosalind had managed to repair her makeup and smooth her hair, but her confident demeanor was gone. She sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Your Honor, Rosalind's lead attorney, Marcus Blackstone, stood with obvious reluctance. After reviewing the documents presented by Judge Chen, we request a continuance to properly examine and potentially challenge the admissibility of evidence that was not disclosed during discovery. Before I could respond, Lydia's attorney, Sarah Martinez, rose from her chair. Your Honor, the plaintiff has the right to request a continuance, but I believe the court should be aware that these documents were specifically sealed by the deceased with instructions for use only in the event of a will contest. Ashworth essentially predicted this exact scenario and prepared accordingly. The documents are self-authenticating through Judge Chen's testimony and the documented chain of custody. I considered both arguments carefully. Blackstone, under normal circumstances, I might be inclined to grant a brief continuance. However, these documents were specifically created for this purpose by the deceased, and their authenticity has been established. Additionally, your client has insisted throughout these proceedings that she welcomes scrutiny of her qualifications. I see no reason to delay that scrutiny now, but Your Honor, motion denied. We will proceed. Mr. Blackstone, is your client prepared to testify on her own behalf? I watched Blackstone turn to confer with Rosalind. Even from the bench, I could see her shaking her head vehemently. The whispered conversation grew heated, with Rosalind gesturing toward the door as if she wanted to leave. Finally, Blackstone returned to his position. Your Honor, Ashworth would like to make a statement before taking the stand. The proper time for statements is during testimony under oath. Is your client prepared to be sworn in? Another hurried conference. This time, I caught fragments of what Rosalind was saying. Can't make me. Completely unfair. Need to think about this. The delay was becoming obvious to everyone in the courtroom. I could see my parents exchanging concerned glances. Trevor had his head in his hand. The gallery, which had been packed with spectators, expecting a routine inheritance dispute, was now buzzing with whispered conversations about the dramatic turn of events. Finally, Blackstone approached the bench with Sarah Martinez. Your Honor, might we have a brief sidebar? Approach. When both attorneys were close enough for private conversation, Blackstone spoke in urgent whispers. Your Honor, my client is struggling with the unexpected nature of these revelations. She's questioning whether she wants to proceed with her testimony at this time. Miss Blackstone, your client filed this lawsuit. She claimed that she was more worthy than Ms. Ashworth Chen to inherit this estate. She's had ample opportunity to prepare her case. The court has been more than accommodating. But we cannot delay indefinitely because your client is having second thoughts. Sarah Martinez leaned forward. Your Honor, if I may, the defendant is prepared to proceed with our case immediately. We have character witnesses ready to testify about Ms. Ashworth Chen's qualifications, and we can present our evidence efficiently. I looked back at Rosalind, who was now engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly frantic conversation with my parent. Mother was leaning forward, speaking in the sharp, authoritative tone she'd always used when trying to control difficult situations. Father was checking his watch repeatedly, clearly frustrated by the delay. Return to your positions, I instructed the attorneys. Miss Ashworth, you have 5 minutes to decide whether you wish to testify in support of your claim. If you choose not to testify, the court will proceed with the defendant's case and make a decision based on the evidence currently available. The threat of proceeding without her testimony seemed to galvanize Rosalind. She stood up from the plaintiff's table, her jaw set with determination. For a moment, she looked like the confident woman who had walked into the courtroom that morning. Your Honor, I'll testify. I have nothing to hide, and I want this court to understand exactly why I deserve my father-in-law's inheritance. As she walked to the witness stand, I felt a complex mixture of emotion. Part of me, the sister who had been dismissed and underestimated for years, was anticipating the satisfaction of watching her dig her own legal grave, but part of me, the judge who had sworn to uphold justice impartially, felt genuinely sad about what was about to happen. The bailiff administered the oath, and Rosalind placed her hand on the Bible with a steadiness that surprised me. Whatever internal crisis she'd experienced during the recess, she had apparently decided to brazen through it. Please state your name for the record, Blackstone began. Rosalind Thornfield Ashworth. Mrs. Ashworth, you are contesting the will of Edmund Ashworth, who left the bulk of his estate to your sister-in-law, Lydia Ashworth Chen. In your own words, please tell the court why you believe you are more qualified to manage this inheritance. This was it, the moment I had been anticipating for weeks. Rosalind was about to explain to my face why people like me, people who chose service over status, were inherently inferior to people like her. Your Honor, Rosalind began, turning to address me directly, I understand that this court must make a difficult decision about the distribution of a substantial estate. I want to be completely transparent about my qualifications and my vision for how this inheritance should be managed. Her voice was steady, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the witness stand rail. First, I want to address my educational background. I graduated from Whitmore University with a degree in business administration. Whitmore is one of the most prestigious institutions in the country, and the education I received there prepared me to understand complex financial systems and long-term wealth management strategy. She paused, glancing briefly at the documents that now sat on my desk, documents that proved she had purchased her way through Whitmore rather than earning her degree through academic merit. Second, I have extensive experience in charitable work and community leadership. For the past 5 years, I have served as the founding director of the Millbrook Heights Children's Fund, which has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for underprivileged youth in our community. Another pause. The surveillance reports detailing her theft from that same charity fund were sitting less than 10 feet away from where she spoke. Third, I believe I understand the responsibility that comes with managing significant wealth. Unlike some people who might view inherited money as an opportunity for personal idealism or social experimentation, I understand that large estates require practical, business-minded management to preserve and grow them for future generations. There it was, the distinction she'd always made between people like herself and people like me. Practical business management versus personal idealism and social experimentation, her euphemisms for actually helping people in need. Your Honor, I'm not here to diminish my sister-in-law's work. I'm sure her efforts with disadvantaged children bring her personal satisfaction, but managing a $47 million estate requires different skills than working in social services. It requires understanding markets, investments, tax strategies, and long-term financial planning. As she spoke, I realized that Rosalind was making exactly the argument Edmund Ashworth had predicted she would make. She was essentially arguing that helping people was a pleasant hobby, while managing money was serious work that required superior intellect and character. Furthermore, Your Honor, I believe I represent the values that made the Ashworth fortune possible in the first place. Edmund Ashworth built his business through strategic thinking, practical decision-making, and an understanding of how to work within established systems to create prosperity. These are the same values that guide my approach to philanthropy and wealth management. I almost smiled at that last statement. Edmund's own words, documented in his private papers, had described Rosalind as representing everything I spent my life working against. In conclusion, Your Honor, while I respect different approaches to public service, I believe this estate requires stewardship by someone who understands that the best way to help society is to ensure that wealth is managed responsibly by qualified individuals who can maximize its positive impact through strategic giving and sound investment practices. Rosalind finished her opening statement and looked at me expectantly, clearly believing she had made a compelling case for her superiority. She had no idea that every word she'd spoken had been perfectly crafted to demonstrate exactly why Edmund Ashworth had chosen to exclude her from his will. Now came the cross-examination, where Sarah Martinez would systematically dismantle every claim Rosalind had just made, using the very evidence that Edmund had so carefully compiled. This was where the real destruction would begin. Sarah Martinez rose from her chair with the quiet confidence of someone who had just been handed a perfect hand in poker. She approached the witness stand carrying a thick folder that I knew contained copies of every document Edmund Ashworth had so carefully compiled. Mrs. Ashworth, Sarah began, her voice professionally cordial, you testified that you graduated from Whitmore University with a degree in business administration. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And you characterized this education as preparing you to understand complex financial systems and long-term wealth management strategies. Correct? Yes. Sarah opened her folder and removed a document. Ashworth, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit A1, your official transcript from Whitmore University. Can you confirm that this is an accurate record of your academic performance? Rosalind took the transcript, and I watched the color drain from her face as she recognized what she was looking at, not the sanitized version she was used to seeing, but the original record that showed her actual grades before they were purchased. This appears to be some kind of error in the records. An error, Mrs. Ashworth? This transcript shows that you failed constitutional law, ethics and legal practice, and social justice and public policy in your junior year. It also shows you were placed on academic probation twice. Are you testifying under oath that these records are incorrect? There may have been some confusion in the administrative process. My final grades were different. Sarah pulled out another document. Yes, let's talk about those final grades. I'm now showing you Exhibit A2, internal university correspondence between your father Harrison Thornfield and Dean Morrison at Whitmore. Would you like me to read the relevant portions aloud? Rosalind's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. These documents are highly prejudicial and their authenticity is questionable. Your Honor, Sarah responded smoothly. These documents were obtained and authenticated by a private investigator hired by the deceased specifically to verify the character of potential heir. They come with a complete chain of custody documentation and have been verified by university officials. I had to make a decision that would determine how the rest of this hearing proceeded. Objection overruled. The witness may review the document and answer the question. Sarah continued reading from the correspondence. Following receipt of your generous $250,000 donation to the Library Construction Fund, we will arrange for the necessary grade adjustments to ensure your daughter's academic standing is restored. The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Rosalind's labored breathing. Mrs. Ashworth, are you aware that your family donated a total of $45,000 to Whitmore University during your 4 years there, with each donation followed by improvements to your academic record? My family has always been generous supporters of education. Rosalind said weakly, That's an interesting way to describe purchasing grades. Now let's discuss your charitable work. You testified that you founded the Millbrook Heights Children's Fund and that it has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for underprivileged youth. Is that your testimony? Yes. Sarah retrieved another set of documents. I'm showing you exhibits B1 through B15, which are complete financial records for the Children's Fund spanning the past 5 years. According to these records, the fund has indeed raised $35,000 during that period. However, only $23,000 of that money actually reached children in need. Can you explain where the remaining $36,000 to $4,000 went? Administrative costs are a normal part of any charitable organization. Administrative costs of 94%. Mrs. Ashworth, these records show payments to companies like RTA Consulting LLC, Premium Learning Solutions, and Golden Crest Event Planning. Are you familiar with these companies? I watched Rosalind's face as she realized the trap she was walking into. She could either lie under oath about companies that could be easily traced back to her, or admit to systematic fraud. Some of those may have provided services to the fund. Mrs. Ashworth, RTA Consulting LLC, is registered in your name. Premium Learning Solutions provided private tutoring services for wealthy families in Golden Crest Estates, and Golden Crest Event Planning organized parties for your social circle. Are you seriously testifying that these were legitimate charity expenses? There may have been some confusion in the record keeping. Confusion? Or fraud? Sarah let the question hang in the air before continuing. Let's move on to your understanding of the Ashworth family value. You testified that you represent the values that made the Ashworth fortune possible. Are you familiar with Edmund Ashworth's personal writings about integrity and social responsibility? I believe he valued hard work and success. Sarah produced another document. This is Exhibit C1, a personal letter Edmund Ashworth wrote to the State Ethics Commission, describing his philosophy about inherited wealth. Would you like me to read his exact words? Rosalind looked desperately at her attorney, who could only shake his head helplessly. He wrote, and I quote, "The greatest tragedy of inherited wealth is when it flows to those who mistake privilege for virtue and entitlement for accomplishment. True worthiness reveals itself through service to others, not service to oneself. Sarah paused to let those words sink in before continuing. Mrs. Ashworth, you also testified that managing wealth requires different skills than working in social services, and suggested that your sister-in-law's work represents personal idealism rather than practical value. Are you aware of Lydia Ashworth Chen's actual qualifications and achievements? I know she works with disadvantaged children. She graduated first in her class from Harvard Law School, Mrs. Ashworth. She turned down a $300,000 starting salary at a corporate firm to take a $45,000 job helping children in the foster care system. Over the past decade, she has personally handled over 200 cases and has never lost a single child to the system who could have been safely placed with family. She has also donated over $400,000 of her own money to various children's charities, nearly twice what your fund raised, and she gave her own money rather than soliciting it from others. I could see Rosalind shrinking in the witness chair as the comparison became clear to everyone in the courtroom. Furthermore, Mrs. Ashworth, are you aware that Lydia has been personally mentoring a young woman named Maria Santos, who aged out of foster care with no family support? Lydia paid for Maria's education, helped her find housing, and guided her through college. Maria graduated last month with a degree in social work and is now helping other foster children. Would you characterize that as personal idealism or as practical life-changing impact? I don't know about her specific cases. Of course you don't, because you've never bothered to learn about the actual work she does, have you? Just as you never bothered to actually help the children your fund was supposedly created to serve. Sarah walked back to her table and picked up one final document. Mrs. Ashworth, I'm showing you Exhibit D1, a surveillance report documenting your activities over a 6-month period. According to this report, you were observed removing donated items from your charity office for personal use, staging publicity photos without participating in actual volunteer work, and stating on a recorded phone call that only idiots actually care about helping poor people. Do you deny making that statement? The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing and was staring at Rosalind in disbelief. That's taken out of context. What context would make that statement acceptable, Mrs. Ashworth? Rosalind opened her mouth, then closed it again. No answer came. Mrs. Ashworth, based on the evidence presented today, you have committed academic fraud, charity fraud, and tax fraud. You have shown systematic contempt for the very people your charitable work was supposed to help. You have demonstrated that your understanding of worthiness is based entirely on social status rather than actual accomplishment. Given all of this, why should this court award you $47 million that you clearly intend to use for personal enrichment rather than the betterment of society? Rosalind sat in the witness chair, tears streaming down her face, unable to form a coherent response. The confident woman who had walked into my courtroom that morning was gone, replaced by someone who had just been systematically exposed as a fraud in front of her family, the media, and the entire legal community. Sarah Martinez returned to her table. No further questions, Your Honor. I looked at Rosalind's attorney. Redirect? Blackstone stood briefly, looked at his client's devastated expression, and sat back down. No questions, Your Honor. The strategic strike was complete. Sarah Martinez had used Edmund Ashworth's evidence like a surgical instrument, methodically dismantling every claim Rosalind had made about her worthiness, her education, her charity work, and her character. But I wasn't finished yet. Now came the moment I had been waiting for my entire life, the moment when I would reveal exactly who had been making these decisions. Her mascara had streaked down her cheeks, her expensive suit was wrinkled from nervous fidgeting, and her hands shook as she gripped the armrests of the chair. Mrs. Ashworth, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, before I render my decision in this matter, I have a few additional questions for you. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, clearly hoping that somehow she could still salvage something from this disaster. You have testified extensively today about worthiness, qualifications, and the proper management of inherited wealth. You have argued that you deserve this inheritance because you represent superior judgment and capability. Is that a fair summary of your position? Yes, Your Honor, she whispered, and you have suggested that people who choose public service over personal profit, demonstrate poor judgment and lack the practical intelligence necessary for important decisions. Is that also accurate? Rosalind hesitated, clearly recognizing the trap, but unable to see a way out. I believe that different types of work require different skill sets. I see. And in your view, someone who works in, say, food service or lives modestly would be inherently less qualified to make important decisions than someone who attended prestigious schools and married into wealth. Not inherently, but practical experience matters. I leaned forward slightly, my voice taking on an edge that made several people in the gallery sit up straighter. Mrs. Ashworth, do you know anything about the judge who is deciding your case today? The question clearly caught her off guard. No, Your Honor. Should I? Well, let me enlighten you. The judge deciding whether you deserve $47 million graduated summa cum laude from Crestview University, while working 3 jobs to pay her own tuition. She then attended Hillstone Law School, again on merit scholarships, again working multiple jobs to support herself. She spent 5 years as a prosecutor, earning a reputation for integrity and competence that led to her appointment to this bench at age 32. I paused, watching comprehension begin to dawn on Rosalind's face. This judge has spent her entire career fighting for justice, helping victims of crime, and ensuring that the legal system works fairly for everyone, not just for people with money and connection. She has never purchased a grade, never stolen from charity, and never looked down on someone for choosing service over personal enrichment. Rosalind's mouth fell open as the implications began to sink in. Furthermore, Miss Ashworth, this judge worked for several years at a diner called Ruby's while putting herself through school. She lived in a small apartment on Elm Street and saved every penny to achieve her goals without family money or influence. The gallery had gone completely silent. I could see my parents in my peripheral vision, both of them frozen as they began to process what they were hearing. Mrs. Ashworth, earlier today you heard your father call this judge and explain that his younger daughter was too incompetent for important responsibilities because she worked in food service and lived modestly. Do you recall that conversation? Rosalind was staring at me now, really seeing me for the first time. Let me refresh your memory. Your father told this court that his younger daughter clearly lacks the practical intelligence necessary for important decisions, and that she works in a diner and lives in some tiny apartment downtown. Those were his exact words about someone he felt was inherently inferior to you. I stood up slowly, allowing my full authority as a judge to fill the courtroom. Mrs. Ashworth, I am that daughter. I am Judge Delilah Thorne. I am the sister you have spent your entire life dismissing as worthless. I am the person you tried to manipulate on the phone this morning. And I am the judge who will now decide whether you deserve a single penny of Edmund Ashworth's fortune. The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery. I heard my mother's voice cry out, "Oh my God," and saw my father's face go white with shock. Trevor was staring at me with his mouth open. Reporters were frantically scribbling notes, but I focused on Rosalind. She was looking at me as if I were a ghost, her brain struggling to reconcile the sister she'd always seen as a failure with the figure of authority sitting in judgment over her future. "You're Delilah," she whispered. "Yes, Rosalind. I'm Delilah. The worthless sister. The one who made poor life choices. The one who lacks practical intelligence. I'm also the judge who has spent the last hour listening to you explain why people like me are inherently inferior to people like you." I could see her trying to process this information, trying to figure out how to respond to a complete reversal of everything she thought she knew about our family dynamics. "Your Honor, Delilah, you never bothered to learn what I accomplished because you were so certain I could never accomplish anything worth knowing about. You assumed that someone working at a diner couldn't possibly be working towards something great. You assumed that someone living modestly couldn't possibly be choosing that lifestyle while building a career in public service." I looked out at the packed courtroom, at the reporters scribbling frantically, at my parents who looked like they'd been struck by lightning. "Mrs. Ashworth, you have spent this entire hearing arguing that you deserve Edmund Ashworth's inheritance because you represent superior judgment and worthiness. You have claimed that people who choose service over status are misguided idealists who lack practical intelligence. You have argued that wealth should flow to those who understand its proper management. I paused, letting the weight of the moment build. But here's what you failed to understand. You have been making that argument to someone who represents everything you claim is inferior. You have been asking for money from someone you believe is inherently less capable than you are. You have been begging for approval from the sister you've always treated as worthless. Rosalind started to speak, but I held up my hand to stop her. But most importantly, Mrs. Ashworth, you have demonstrated today that your entire worldview is built on a foundation of ignorance and prejudice. You believe that worth is inherited rather than earned, that status matters more than character, and that helping others is a sign of weakness rather than strength. I looked directly at her, this sister who had spent decades making me feel invisible and insignificant. Edmund Ashworth understood something that you never learned. True worthiness isn't about where you went to school or who you married or how much money your family had. It's about what you do with the opportunities you're given, and whether you use your advantages to lift others up or to tear them down. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind me. You wanted to know if I think you deserve $47 million. After everything I've seen and heard today, I can tell you exactly what Edmund Ashworth would say if he were sitting here right now. I reached for my gavel, feeling the weight of not just legal authority, but of decades of dismissed achievements, ignored accomplishments, and underestimated potential. The court will now render its decision. I lifted my gavel, and the sound it made striking the bench seemed to echo through the silent courtroom, like a final bell. Every eye was fixed on me as I prepared to deliver the decision that would reshape my family forever. In the matter of Ashworth versus Ashworth, this court has been asked to determine who is most worthy to inherit the estate of Edmund Ashworth, a man who dedicated his life to building something meaningful and ensuring it would continue to benefit society after his death. I looked directly at Rosalind, who sat frozen in the witness chair like a deer caught in headlights. The evidence presented today has painted a clear picture of two very different approaches to life and responsibility. On one side, we have a plaintiff who purchased her education, embezzled from charity, and built her entire case on the assumption that status and connections matter more than character and accomplishment. I turned to look at Lydia, who sat with quiet dignity despite having just witnessed one of the most dramatic courtroom revelations in legal history. On the other side, we have a defendant who earned her achievements through merit, sacrificed personal wealth to help vulnerable children, and has dedicated her career to ensuring that society's most powerless members receive justice and protection. I paused, letting the contrast sink in completely. But this case is about more than just comparing two individuals. It's about examining the fundamental question that Edmund Ashworth posed in his will. What does it mean to be worthy of inheriting the fruit of a lifetime's honest work? I opened the folder containing Edmund's final letter, and read directly from his words. I have structured this bequest to force the truth into the light. Those who deserve inheritance will welcome scrutiny. Those who do not will reveal themselves through their reaction to being examined. I looked back at Rosalind. Mrs. Ashworth, your reaction to scrutiny has been to lie under oath, deny documented evidence, and maintain that your systematic fraud was merely confusion in record-keeping. You have shown this court exactly the character that Edmund Ashworth spent his life working against. I could see tears streaming down her face now, but I wasn't finished. Furthermore, your testimony today revealed something even more troubling than financial fraud. You demonstrated a worldview that sees helping others as evidence of poor judgment, that mistakes privilege for virtue, and that believes worth can be inherited rather than earned. I stood up, my judicial robes flowing around me as I delivered the final blow. Miss Ashworth, you are exactly the kind of person Edmund Ashworth wrote his will to exclude. You represent everything he spent his life fighting against, the belief that money exists solely for personal gratification, and that those who choose service over status are somehow inferior. I turned to address the entire courtroom. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Lydia Ashworth Chen. The will of Edmund Ashworth shall be executed exactly as written. Miss Ashworth Chen is hereby confirmed as the rightful heir to the estate, and Miss Ashworth's challenge is denied in its entirety. I brought my gavel down with finality. Furthermore, In accordance with the specific provisions of Edmund Ashworth's will, Mrs. Ashworth's challenge triggers the penalty clause. She forfeits any claim to inheritance and will receive exactly $1, as was Edmund Ashworth's final wish. The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters rushed toward the doors to file their stories. Spectators buzzed with excited conversation about what they'd just witnessed. But I focused on my family's reactions. Rosalind had collapsed forward in the witness chair, sobbing uncontrollably. The confident woman who had walked into my courtroom expecting easy victory was gone, replaced by someone who had just lost everything, not just the money, but her entire sense of superiority and entitlement. My parents sat in stunned silence, both of them staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Mother's face was pale with shock. Father kept opening and closing his mouth as if trying to speak but finding no word. Trevor looked relieved, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. He was already making his way toward Lydia to congratulate her. But Lydia herself simply sat quietly, tears of gratitude in her eyes, overwhelmed by the validation of her life's work and the resources that would now allow her to help so many more children. I banged my gavel again to restore order. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom began to empty, Rosalind slowly stood from the witness chair and walked toward me. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, her makeup ruined, her perfectly styled hair disheveled. She looked nothing like the polished socialite who had entered my courtroom that morning. "Delilah," she whispered when she reached the bench. I'm sorry. I never knew. I never understood." I looked down at her, literally and figuratively from my position of authority. "Rosalind, you never knew because you never bothered to. You never understood because you were so certain of your own superiority that you couldn't imagine learning anything from someone you considered beneath you. But you're my sister, your family. How could you do this to me?" The question revealed everything that was still wrong with her thinking. "I didn't do this to you, Rosalind. You did this to yourself. Every lie you told, every dollar you stole, every person you dismissed, those were your choices. I simply ensured that those choices had consequences." I gathered my papers and prepared to leave the bench. "For 28 years you made me feel worthless. You dismissed my achievements, ignored my accomplishments, and treated me like I didn't matter. Today, you learned that the person you thought was worthless actually had the power to change your life forever." I stood to leave, then turned back for one final observation. "Edmund Ashworth understood something you never learned. Real power doesn't come from money or status, or connection. It comes from competence, integrity, and the respect you earn through your actions. That's why he trusted his fortune to someone who would use it to help others, rather than someone who would use it to help herself." As I walked toward my chambers, I heard my father's voice calling out behind me, "Delilah, wait, we need to talk." I paused at the doorway to my chambers and turned around. My parents were both standing now, looking lost and confused in the middle of the emptying courtroom. "Actually, Father, we don't need to talk. For the first time in my life you need to listen. You called me this morning to explain why I was too incompetent for important responsibilities. You spent decades dismissing my achievements because they didn't fit your definition of success. You raised one daughter to believe she was entitled to everything, and another daughter to believe she deserved nothing." I gestured toward Rosalind, who was still standing near the witness chair, looking defeated. "Look at the results of your parenting philosophy. Look at what your superior daughter became when she thought no one was watching. Look at what your inferior daughter accomplished when she stopped seeking your approval and started building something real." I opened the door to my chamber. "I've spent my entire life trying to earn your respect and recognition. Today, I realized I don't need either one. I have something much more valuable. I have the respect I've earned from people who matter, doing work that makes a difference in the world." 3 months later, I received a handwritten letter from Lydia Ashworth Chen. She had used part of Edmund's inheritance to establish the Ashworth Foundation for Children's Advocacy, which had already funded legal representation for over 50 at-risk youth. She'd also created a scholarship program for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue careers in public service. The letter included a photo of Maria Santos, the young woman Lydia had mentored through college. At her graduation from law school, Maria was now working as a public defender, continuing the cycle of service that Edmund Ashworth had wanted to perpetuate. At the bottom of the letter, Lydia had written, "Thank you for ensuring that Edmund's legacy went to someone who would honor it. Your courage in that courtroom didn't just change my life, it changed the lives of countless children who will benefit from this foundation for generations to come." I kept that letter in my desk drawer, next to a small framed photo of myself in judicial robes, a reminder that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up needing your mercy the least. Justice, I learned that day, isn't just about punishment. It's about ensuring that power flows to those who will use it to build rather than destroy, to lift others up rather than tear them down. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice has a perfect sense of poetic timing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.